Preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx, 1859. I consider the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, state, foreign trade, world market. Under the first three heads, I examined the conditions of the economic existence of the three great classes which make up modern bourgeois society. The connection of the three remaining heads is self-evident. The first part of the first book, treating of capital, consists of the following chapters: 1. Commodity, 2. Money, or simple circulation, 3. Capital in general. The first two chapters form the contents of the present work. The entire material lies before me in the form of monographs, written at long intervals, not for publication, but for the purpose of clearing up those questions to myself, and their systematic elaboration on the plan outlined above will depend upon circumstances. I omit a general introduction which I had prepared, as on second thought any anticipation of results that are still to be proven seemed to me objectionable, and the reader who wishes to follow me at all must make up his mind to pass from the special to the general. On the other hand, some remarks as to the course of my own politico-economic studies may be in place here. The subject of my professional studies was jurisprudence, which I pursued, however, in connection with and as secondary to the studies of philosophy and history. In 1842-43, as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, I found myself embarrassed at first when I had to take part in discussions concerning so-called material interests. The proceedings of the Rhine Diet in connection with forest thefts and the extreme subdivision of landed property, the official controversy about the condition of the Mosel peasants, into which Herr von Schaper, and at that time president of the Rhine province, entered with the Rheinische Zeitung, finally the debates on free trade and protection, gave me the first impulse to take up the study of economic questions. At the same time, a weak, quasi-philosophic echo of French socialism and communism made itself heard in the Rheinische Zeitung, in those days when the good intentions to go ahead greatly outweighed knowledge of facts. I declared myself against such botching, but had to admit at once in a controversy with the Allgemeine Augsburger Zeitung that my previous studies did not allow me to hazard an independent judgment as to the merits of the French schools. When, therefore, the publishers of the Rheinische Zeitung conceived the illusion that by a less aggressive policy the paper could be saved from the death sentence pronounced upon it, I was glad to grasp that opportunity to retire to my study room from public life. The first work undertaken for the solution of the question that troubled me was a critical revision of Hegel's philosophy of law. The introduction to that work appeared in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, published in Paris in 1844. I was led by my studies to the conclusion that the legal relations, as well as forms of state, could neither be understood by themselves nor explained by the so-called general progress of the human mind, but that they are rooted in the material conditions of life, which are summed up by Hegel after the fashion of the English and French of the 18th century under the name civic society. The anatomy of that civic society is to be sought in political economy. The study of the latter, which I had taken up in Paris, I continued at Brussels, whither I emigrated on account of an order of expulsion issued by Mr. Guizot. The general conclusion at which I arrived and which, once reached, continued to serve as the leading thread of my studies, may be briefly summed up as follows. In the social production which men carry on, they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their materialist powers of production. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but, on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production in society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they had been at work before. From forms of development of the forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. Then comes the period of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, the distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must rather be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social forces of production and the relations of production. No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new, higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. Therefore, mankind always takes up only such problems as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, we will always find that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for its solution already exist, or are at least in the process of formation. In broad outlines, we can designate the Asiatic, the ancient, the feudal, and the modern bourgeois methods of production as so many epochs in the progress of the economic formation of society. The bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of one arising from the conditions surrounding the life of individuals in society. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation constitutes, therefore, the closing chapter of the prehistoric stage of human society. Friedrich Engels, with whom I was continually corresponding and exchanging ideas since the appearance of his ingenious critical essay on economic categories in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, came by a different road to the same conclusions as myself. See his Condition of the Working Classes in England. When he, too, settled in Brussels in the spring of 1845, we decided to work out together the contrast between our view and the idealism of the German philosophy. In fact, to settle our accounts with our former philosophic conscience. The plan was carried out in the form of a criticism of the post-Hegelian philosophy. The manuscript, in 2 solid octavo volumes, had long reached the publisher in Westphalia, when we received information that conditions had so changed as not to allow of its publication. We abandoned the manuscript in the stinging criticism of the mice the more readily since we had accomplished our main purpose, the clearing up of the question to ourselves. Of the scattered writings on various subjects in which we presented our views to the public at the time, I recall only the Manifesto of the Communist Party, written by Engels and myself, and the Discourse on Free Trade, written by myself. The leading points of our theory were first presented scientifically, though in a polemic form, in my Misère de la philosophie, etc., directed against Proudhon and published in 1847. An essay on wage labor, written by me in German, and in which I put together my lectures on the subject delivered before the German Workmen's Club at Brussels, was prevented from leaving the hands of the printer by the February Revolution and my expulsion from Belgium, which followed it as a consequence. The publication of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in 1848 and 1849 and the events which took place later on interrupted my economic studies, which I could not resume before 1850 in London. The enormous material on the history of political economy which is accumulated in the British Museum, the favourable view which London offers for the observation of bourgeois society, finally the new stage of development upon which the latter seemed to have entered with the discovery of gold in California and Australia, led me to the decision to resume my studies from the very beginning and to work up critically the new material. These studies partly led to what might seem side questions, over which I nevertheless had to stop for longer or shorter periods of time. Especially was the time at my disposal cut down by the imperative necessity of working for a living. My work as contributor on the leading Anglo-American newspaper, the New York Tribune, at which I have now been engaged for 8 years, has caused very great interruption in my studies, since I engage in newspaper work proper only occasionally. Yet articles on important economic events in England and on the continent have formed so large a part of my contributions that I have been obliged to make myself familiar with practical details which lie outside the proper sphere of political economy. This account of the course of my studies in political economy is simply to prove that my views, whatever one may think of them, and no matter how little they agree with the interested prejudices of the ruling classes, are the result of many years of conscientious research. At the entrance of science, however, the same requirement must be put as at the entrance to hell. Here must all distrust be left. All cowardice must here be dead. From Dante's Divine Comedy. Karl Marx, London, January 1859.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Mackenzie. So to be a vulgar Marxist for a moment, the notion of Marx's notion of the sort of the motive force of history is that the forces of production develop and at a certain point come into conflict or contradiction with the relations of production. So, we know how that story was supposed to work for capitalism. How do you see that story playing itself out in this new, assertedly new mode of production that you have posited?
Yeah, and to sort of do the inside baseball thing, what I did was go back from Capital to the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, which to me is the best thing Marx ever wrote. And it's this amazingly condensed philosophy of history that you could argue with, but is incredibly condensed. And to kind of say, before Marx wrote about capitalism, he wrote about modes of production. And there's a kind of methodology for understanding social formations and their history. So let's go back to that bit to sort of figure out, actually maybe capital is about one moment in it and there's other ones. But yeah, to me that's still sort of fundamental, that it's your methodological starting point. You wouldn't want to stay here forever, but your starting point is look to how are the necessities of social life being produced, and how does that change through time? How is a surplus created? How are classes then formed in relation to the particular way it's created? And to me, that's a way of understanding all of human history. So not just capital or what comes after. So to me, that's kind of fundamental, is to go back to that really kind of vulgar And it's very strong in the Anglophone philosophy that New Left Review ended up not reading and going somewhere else, yeah? So to sort of go back to some of those lost sources to sort of rethink that. J.D. Bernal's Science and History, I think, was incredibly useful for me for thinking that through. He applies it to the whole of history. Joseph Needham's magnificent history of Chinese science and technology. Yeah, so start with that basic question of how is social necessity produced?
The proceedings of the Rhine Diet in connection with forest theft